Good evening. I'm hearing from the backstage that I'm now live, so hopefully you're now hearing me, which would be great. Hi, I'm Shelly Knotts. I'm an artist and a researcher. I work at Durham University in the UK right now. And I'm going to give a talk that I've called Punk Programming, Recoding the Politics of Electronic Music. So I'm going to try and talk a little bit about some of the electronic music scenes that I'm involved in, how I'm maybe thinking a bit politically about those scenes, and also how I've been thinking a bit more recently about the intersections between that style of performing and punk and DIY aesthetics. So to give you an idea of how this talk is going to function, here's a little overview. So I'm going to talk about live coding music, whatever that is, and Algorave, which is a scene sort of within that, a bit about failure and feminism, punk programming practice, and sort of slip in some stuff about data AI and bias at the end. And then I'm going to try and do a demo. I'm not sure how the audio is for you, but maybe you can let me know if it sounds terrible, and then I'll do less of that and more talking. So just to give you a bit of an idea about me, I call myself an accidental algoraver. This is a thing I've been doing since about 2012. It's not really what I set out in life to do, but I followed a bunch of strange and diverse paths in electronic music, and that's where I've ended up. So my background is kind of in electronic music scenes. I've been working with code on various types of music projects since about 2005. And I use various languages, including SuperCollider, which is sort of a mammoth of an audio programming language, Hydra, which is for making the nice visuals that you see in the background here, SonicPy and Ixielang, which are some other sort of smaller music programming languages. I'm really interested in improvisation, so I do that alone and also with jazz musicians, other live coders, dancers sometimes, and visual artists. And I also build software for those sort of collaborative performance practices. I sort of exist in an experimental music scene, but I also make noise. I sometimes work with jazz musicians. And in the last 8 years, so it's a really long time, now I've been also making beats within the Algorave scene. I also have some other things that I'm interested in. So right now I work on this cool project called Mimic, which is about making music and art with machine intelligence. So we're looking at the intersection of making music with code, with AI and machine listening, which is sort of the generating data out of audio files and doing fun stuff with it, and also live coding. So that's sort of a web platform where you can like learn about those stuff and see some nice examples and make your own projects. So that's mimicproject.com if you're interested in checking that out. So today I'm mostly going to be talking about live coding. So to give you an idea about what live coding is essentially about performing with code. It's often performing music, but there's also practices in dance and visual arts as well, and other sort of weird experimental practices with web browsers. There's lots of different ways of doing this, but the sort of basic idea is that you get on stage, you start typing away in whatever programming language you're using, and you start making sound, hearing what you're doing, changing the code, and sort of building up a performance around that. So here's various live coders. This is Alexandra Cardenas on the left. I think that's the left here, who's sort of a composer turned live coder, then Alex McLean at the bottom, and then a German live coding boy band, Benoit and the Mandelbrot's up at the top, who all have kind of quite different practices in live coding, but it all fits under the same umbrella. So to give you an idea where live coding came from, the sort of very short history is that people have been doing this since about 2000, where Alex McLean and Julian Rohrhuber made some various tools to allow them to make music and change the code that they're writing during a performance and have it update at the time. So they started building like a little community around this, and then in 2004 they formed the Not So Temporary Top Lap. I believe that happened in a very smoky bar in Hamburg. A group of people decided to form it's called the Temporary Organization for the Promotion of Live Algorithmic Performance or Programming. I always forget. And that was sort of a manifesto that they wrote about what this means to do this as a practice, and some web pages. And that sort of evolved over some years into a nice website, toplap.org, where you can find out about everything live coding. And so that was sort of a small community that kind of rumbled on for quite a long time. And then in 2012 was the first Algorave. So Algorave was kind of meant to be a joke. I think this was Alex McLean and Nick Collins in a car on the way back from a gig late at night, thought it would be really funny to start making dance music parties where they do live coding. And so they did it. And the first Algorave, which I happened to be at, was a sort of a weird underground noise venue in a skyscraper in London in 2012. And yeah, that sort of took off and became more sort of like the public facing side of live coding. And now it's sort of happening all over the world, and has become this sort of like huge global scene because someone took a joke a bit too seriously. But that's cool. So yeah, out of that, there's sort of evolved a lot of different languages for doing live coding with. The sort of main ones used to be Super Collider, which is what I use, and Tidal Cycles. Super Collider is a bit old hat these days because it's quite hard to live code with. Tidal Cycles has become like quite a big community. But then there's lots of little languages that have kind of spawned out of this scene, which sort of maybe approach live coding in various different ways, maybe facilitate different types of music making, etc. And as I said, that sort of out of that become this sort of huge and amorphous global live coding scene. Today I'm mostly going to talk about Algorave and not so much about experimental live coding, because it's maybe the I see it as like really culturally interesting to sort of form this weird nerdy club scene around doing programming live on stage. Algorave's happening in a lot of different contexts right now. So on the slide there's sort of a big Algorave that happened at a music festival in the UK, one from Amsterdam at the top, and then in the middle there was one of the first Algoraves that happened on a boat. That was moored in London for a while. But it also happens in maybe some more artsy venues, maybe some more big mainstream clubby venues. So it's sort of something that's adjusting to its context. So what is Algorave? I hear you ask. They're essentially dance music parties where we have live music, live visuals. The performers are generally improvising. There's lots of interesting stuff going on with algorithms. So people are usually using, it doesn't have to be live coding. It can also be some live algorithmic stuff with other types of hardware or software. But the idea is that it's about humans interacting with algorithms on stage to make music and visuals. But most of all, the thing that I find interesting about Algorave is the community. It's not just about the people on stage, but also about the people who are coming to Algoraves and sort of sharing the code and dancing and having a beer maybe at the bar, perhaps. What is Algorave not? That's a mouthful. There's various press people who like to say that we're the future of music. I don't know, I guess we kind of think that we're the present of music because we're here right now and we're doing it. There's other people that said we're the future of dance music and sort of accused us of various terrible things, like we want to kill DJs by replacing them with our code. That's not what we're about. We're kind of doing our thing, but we also are totally cool with coexisting alongside, often in the same event, with DJs. And yeah, just there's lots of talk about us about being the future. And I guess we see ourselves as the present and exploring things in the here and now, not about exploring things in 10 years' time. It's not really serious programming either, so I'm never writing my most elegant or complicated code when I'm on stage, that's for sure. It's more about what can I hack together in the moment and get working and get some sound going. I think some people write some slightly more elegant and fancy code than I do, but a lot of people, it's more about thinking about like hacking and making stuff work, patching stuff together, and less about grand structural narratives and overarching computational complexity. It's also not really a genre, so there's like a lot of subgenres happening within Algorave. People making different styles of music at the same event. I guess I'm a bit of a noise girl, but there's people making kind of footwork or like exploring reggaeton and other Latin American genres of dance music as well. So it's not really a genre of music, it's more a way of doing music. And it's also not white men programming. Diversity is kind of one of the cornerstones of the Algorave scene, and it's sort of within our guidelines for putting on an Algorave that if it's all white men, then it's not really an Algorave. So we like to encourage diversity of various forms within Algoraves as well, and that's sort of a part of the core of what this is about. So maybe now you're sort of starting to think, oh, can I just hear some music? Maybe not, I don't know. So I thought I'd play you a quick clip. This is a gig from, sorry, someone's saying there's no stream. Hopefully that's just a isolated problem. So this is a gig from about last year, which is me playing with CCAI. I can't remember what that stands for, but a duo of Alex McLean and Sam Schaub at a gig in Sheffield. And Carl Manton and Olivia Jack, who are making visuals together. So this is sort of a big collaborative performance that we did, and I'll just play you a quick clip of that. So that's maybe a bit of a more chill version of Algorave. There's also more sort of banging, clubby Algoraves than that one. So I guess I kind of think about Algorave as like algorithms for the people. So I guess part of what we're about is kind of sharing this process of like making through code. And yeah, it's about kind of coming together, appreciating code, playing with code, maybe not totally understanding the code, but understanding that there's a process that's happening on stage with code. And also, I guess for some people, algorithm is this sort of like word that's often used in the press to describe like big scary things that people are doing with like Facebook and Google. And I guess we're about saying, well, yeah, that's one kind of algorithm, but also there's like the fun algorithms that you can like dance to that aren't at all scary and are about fun and bringing people together. So I think Algorave is kind of interesting from that perspective of bringing people together with and through algorithms. Instead of, I guess, what Google and Facebook do, or other algorithms, which is like pushing people apart or like tracking people, or etc. So I already mentioned we have a website. If you're into websites, you can look at that, toplap.org. Loads of stuff about Algorave here, or live coding in general. There's a discussion forum if you're into that, mailing lists. Any type of communication online that you prefer, there's probably a live coding option for that. Or if you just want to find out about what live coders are doing, there's various articles that are posted there. And yeah, I guess this is kind of part of how the community comes together is through online platforms. And what is the Algorave community? I guess we're artists, we're musicians, we're programmers. There's people with really different backgrounds that have come into Algorave from various different backgrounds. So I come from music and from a composition and improvisation background. There's also people who were programmers who sort of got into Algorave and live coding through being really good coders who wanted to make music with it. So yeah, and there's also like Algorave is like heavy lifting, which is Lucy Cheeseman. In her day job, she's a university administrator, so she's doing neither of those things, but she just came to some workshops and thought it was really interesting and sort of got into Algorave. So part of what we do with Algoraves is try to encourage newcomers. So when people learn to live code or come to a workshop or something, if they seem really interested, we try to get them to play a gig as soon as possible. So we're always mixing these lineups of people who've maybe just started with people who've been doing it for a long time. Because like Algorave and live coding is kind of about learning through practice, like doing it in your bedroom. I suppose that's kind of tricky right now with current context, but doing it in your bedroom, I guess it's just really different to being on stage in a real place with real people. So we sort of try to encourage like learning through doing, which is kind of what I did as well, because I came from an experimental music background. And then Alex McLean was like, hey, do you want to play an Algorave? And I was like, I have no idea how to play beats, but I suppose I'm going to make some noise music and try and quantize it and see how that works out. And I guess I'm still doing it quite a lot of years later. So I guess it did work out. So yeah, we try to encourage people to not be afraid to get in and try stuff early. We're a really international community, so we're kind of all over the place. So UK and Mexico are maybe some of the first scenes, and Germany, and then it's sort of spread from there. So there's quite a big scene in Tokyo, lots of live coding going on in South America. United States has some sort of hotspots of live coding. Then Spain and the Netherlands also have a lot of live coding going on. There's also a little community in Nürnberg of students who are algoraving together. So maybe try and find them at the DAF if you're interested. I forget, it's the art school. They have a Dynamische Akustische Forschung unit who are doing algoraving. Sorry for my German pronunciation. yeah, we don't really define specifically what Algorave is in many ways. So I guess it's about people getting on stage and doing live coding and experimenting with algorithmic processes. But we're sort of deliberately vague because we like people to take Algorave as a sort of umbrella and do what works for their communities with it. So there's no sort of rules about who can organize an Algorave. We want people to sort of reimagine it depending on what makes sense to them. So probably the Algoraves in South America are very different to the ones in Japan, and that's really cool, and we really like that. Yeah, just to maybe talk a little bit more about technical side, but not too much. There's essentially a lot of different software that you can use for live coding, and what software you choose will probably have some influence on the type of music that you make. So Tidal Cycles is really great for beats. Super Collider is not so great for beats, although you can do them, but it's really good for synthesis, which is what I like doing. So making really noisy sounds and quantizing them and stuff like that. Sonic Pi and Ixylang are really good for beginner coders because they're really easy to learn. And then Foxdot's a really interesting one for Python users, maybe because it's Python, so sort of easy to make the step across. And yeah, so if you're interested in looking at some of this software, there's this website, which is github.com/toplab/awesome-live coding. And yeah, if you're interested and code savvy, maybe have a look there and try some software out. And if you don't like the first one you try a different one. Maybe you'll like it better. One of the things that I am really interested in live coding is this sort of idea that sort of integral to live coding is this idea of show us your screens. And that was in the original live code manifesto, the TopLab manifesto, that's what you should do when you're live coding. So this is sort of an idea of like anti-obscurantism and maybe a bit of a reaction against laptop music and electronic music of the 90s and early 2000s, that you don't really know what's going on inside the computer, and people maybe had these like monster music sessions in their software, or monster electronic music patches, which do all sorts of complicated things, but the people on stage have no idea what's going on. And so the live coder says, like, okay, we want to show you our process. We think that's a really interesting part of music making, and it sort of lets the audience into what's going on for the performer. Obviously, there's some really interesting things that come out of this, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. But this is a duo called Scorpion Mouse, who you can see the Lispy kind of code in the background there. And this is sort of maybe a typical setup that you would see in live coding or Algorave performance, that there's sort of the performer on stage and the code projecting either onto them or on the screen behind them. So yeah, we're not, I guess we sort of share some ethos with open source and hacker communities as well, that we're kind of not really owning the code. Like, to me, the code, it's all about the process, and the code that I have at the end of the gig isn't really like a product. It's more like where I got to when I finished. So yeah, we're all happy about the audience seeing that. It's not a secret. You can take my code, you can write it all down, you can write it yourself later. These are some sort of simple algorithms that I probably wrote in a gig once. So this is kind of funny, noisy sound. And this is a sort of really wonky rhythm with the piano sound. So yeah, this is the sort of stuff that would be like written and then destroyed again within like the context of a performance algorithmic code-based open source jazz rave. Yes, exactly that. And yeah, and so we like to put this on stage to also sort of, break some of the mystique about algorithms. They're not necessarily these like huge, big, complex, scary things, but they can also just be like silly little lines of code like this to make a kind of funny, noisy sound. And I guess one of the implications that I find really interesting about projecting your code is it really sets up live coding to share this kind of like narrative of failure. Like, as you can imagine, when you're writing code live on stage, there's like absolutely so many things that can go wrong. From your basic typos, like you put a comma in the wrong place or you put too many zeros, to like forgetting the arguments of like an oscillator. There's all sorts of really weird things that can happen in the moment. And I guess what's kind of interesting is because you're showing your code, the audience see when things are going wrong for you. Maybe there's some error messages on the screen. Maybe your whole system collapsed, which is in this image here. This was from one of those drastically terrible gigs that happened that I did, where my whole system crashed and I had to restart my computer, and there was like a 10-minute gap in the middle of the performance. And yeah, these are the kind of things that happen when you're like writing code live and working with like both unstable code because you've just written it, and also like really open source software that's kind of unstable anyway. And for me, this is interesting because it maybe takes away some of the bravado of coding or some of the like code bro-y, culture-y stuff that, oh, look at me, I'm a superhuman programmer, because like everyone when they're coding has things that go wrong, and when you're live coding, everyone sees that because you're on stage doing that. And yeah, this is just some of the things that can go wrong. So typing something wrong, having a syntax error, failing to remember something, either you or I've had crashes where I've just made a giant reverb and my computer's run out of memory, for example. Random crashes from other problems with the software. Also aesthetic failure. Maybe it just sounds really bad. That's a thing that can happen with live coding because it's improvisation. So yeah. But I guess this is so endemic. Like it hasn't happened so much recently, but certainly in like the first 5 years of live coding, I maybe had a crash like every gig or every second gig. And that's something you just kind of learn to deal with and learn to work around. But I guess when this crash happened in Amsterdam, I was talking to the gig organizer afterwards, and she was just like, yeah, I mean, crashing is just what happens in live coding. And it's right. I mean, I wasn't the only person who crashed that night. Everybody's struggling with sort of code that might break or code that... Thanks. I like my bike too. Code that might break in the minute, and it's so on show with live coding that it's sort of part of the culture, that probably something's going to go wrong. So just to show you how things can really go wrong, this was a gig I played in last year or the year before, I think last year, at the British Library in the UK, which is this like giant library in London. And the gig was like probably the highest turnout gig I ever played. So there was about 700 tickets sold, I think. And I was performing with somebody who was streaming their audio in from Argentina, which like added some complexity to our audio setup because we're also dealing with the streaming at the same time as just the live coding itself, and like everything went wrong. My computer kept crashing because of the streaming. Her internet dropped out. My internet dropped out. I messed some code up and crashed Super Collider. And yeah, there was one point where both of us dropped out at the same time, and it was literal silence. And then I'm just fighting to write some code in the minute to get some sound happening, so it's not like super awkward when you've got 500 people looking at you and it's silent. And I think I like just wrote the most horrible sound I've ever written, and it was just like, okay, I have to work with this now. Like, so I have to get myself out of this situation of kind of making this horrible sound and like work that into like the structure of the music. And yeah, I mean, that's nobody. When I talked to people afterwards, no one really minded. So, I mean, they saw it as some sort of like code failure theater, and I guess that's part of what live coding is about. So let's just have a quick clip of this. It was slightly longer than I remember it being, but that's fine. I can assure you it all gets worse from there. I'm going to move on because I always talk for too long about failure in live coding, so I find it really interesting. So as with every underground music scene, there's been a certain amount of hype with live coding. And I guess I just wanted to highlight the press narratives are maybe a bit different to what we're interested in. So there's always a lot of talk about the technology with live coding, and that's about us being the future, being hackers, which is kind of cool. But I guess we're less interested in the sort of like tech heroism, super tech narratives than we are in the sort of community aspects of live coding. We also had this like really fun video that Resident Advisor made where they interviewed like loads of women in the scene and then didn't actually put them in the video, that documentary that they made at all, just put the men in that they talked about. So we didn't really find it particularly representative of the scene. But they put us on the front cover. This is me in the background. That's my earring. So we kind of found it funny that there's like these maybe dominant electronic music narratives that Algorave isn't quite managing to fit into because we're not the sort of white male techno heroic electronic music that sells Resident Advisor or those communities, what those communities form around. And we're, I guess, more interested in some of the bigger questions from Algorave. So there's a lot of focus on like communities and learning and workshopping. And I find live coding really interesting from that perspective because it's a really different way of learning about coding. So you always get like a audio feedback. You can hear the code. If you change a number, you can like immediately hear how it sounds. And it's a much more intuitive way of learning to code than maybe more traditional like writing an application. And yeah, and it's really fun. You know, we've run a lot of like women-only live coding workshops, which has sort of, I guess, fed into our scene as well. Alexandra has been around the world teaching people to live code around South America and India and other places. And there's also some questions as well about sort of visibility of women in live coding. So for me, coming from originally having different code-based music practices, live coding is like really fun because people can't say like, oh, who wrote your code for you? Because you're literally standing on stage doing it. And I think there's some sort of interesting questions there about having women on stage doing coding and having that kind of visibility and what that means for computer science in general. Yeah, and I guess there's been also some criticism from the Mexican and South American Algorave scenes that the press tends to whitewash Algorave. So there's a lot of focus on the European scenes and not so much focus on the really interesting things that are going on in Mexico and South America, which is, you know, quite different to what's maybe dominating the European scenes. So there's some sort of wider questions about diversity there. So I guess one of the things that I've been interested in and what's saying is thinking about what feminist algorave means. So one of the nicer articles about Algorave was this Mixmag one, apparently you can't say Mixmag, about the sort of women in the live coding scene, sort of shining a light on people doing stuff there. But I think there's some other questions we can ask here as well, is what does it mean to sort of build a feminist practice within largely a sort of algorithmic frame that's largely been built by men. So although there was a lot of women in the start of computing, it was then dominated by men because men pushed women out. And so a lot of the code that's been written in the last 50 plus years has been written by men. So what does it mean to think about that from a feminist perspective? Can we reclaim something of algorithmic art from as a feminist practice? And there's a lot of precedent in Algorave of hearing, supporting, and promoting women, but we're still sort of acting within both this computer science realm that's dominated by men and the larger ecosystem of music technology, which doesn't tend to support and promote women. So there's some questions to be asked there about, yes, maybe we have this small community where there are some women, but not by no means anywhere near 50%. But if you look at the broader electronic music scene that we're sort of within, what does that mean? Yeah, I guess I like this quote from Emma Fox, where she's an electronica artist. She's not a live coder, but she talks about, as women, our legitimacy in tech spaces is called into question, scrutinized more alongside insinuations or outright accusations of cruising on the novelty of having a female body. When your gender is continually pointed to as an anomaly, whether as an aberration, a distraction, or a nifty diversity point score, it becomes something that's central to your experience. And that's certainly true for my experience of Algorave. Is even if people are like, oh yeah, you wrote the code, then they're like, oh, isn't it really weird that you're a woman who does coding stuff? So it's always like, you're never just a live coder on stage, but you're a woman who live codes on stage. And these are kind of real things that real men have said to me over the years. Things like, so how do you get into programming? As if it would be weird that I'm into programming. Isn't it a bit weird that you use Super Collider as a woman? Who programs your systems for you? Like, even with live coding, people still ask those questions, like, which, is kind of funny. And then I guess one of the ones I kind of like is also like, how come there are so many women in live coding? I mean, there aren't that many women in live coding, but comparative to other computer science and electronic music scenes, there are, but there's still a lot of work to do. But it's like people notice because there's a few of us and not just one of us. Yeah, I guess because I'd been thinking about Algorave from a feminist perspective and doing some reading about live coding, I'm going to talk about a piece that I made last year sometime, which is like maybe being a bit more overtly thinking about feminism in the context of Algorave. And I like this quote from Julie Dawn-Smith, who was part of the female improvisation group, who was sort of an experimental improv group in the 60s and 70s. And she says, if the female body is already a spectacle by virtue of her difference, then making a spectacle of oneself is by improvising that difference is a crucial performance of agency. So I was interested in how we can like really grasp onto, really performing the sort of feminist side of Algorave. So I started reading about Riot Girl, which was a early 1990s punk music. And Riot Girl kind of came out of a reaction to the misogyny of male-dominated hardcore punk. So around the start of the 90s, hardcore punk sort of started emerging. And I guess where women had sort of been a little bit part of punk scenes, they were really not part of hardcore punk because it sort of explicitly pushed women out and used more and more misogynist language. So the Riot Girls decided to push back against this by making their own scene. So they were kind of organized at the time through making scenes and writing, sort of forming little local groups, getting together, publishing, writing about how they were feeling and thinking about this. And then through that, seizing the means of production to make explicitly feminist punk that spoke of their experiences and not just of the sort of male experience of life and punk music. So I guess the reason I was interested in Riot Girl specifically was, I guess I see a lot of synergy between punk music and Algorave, because I mean, Algorave's really like getting up on stage and doing stuff that's going to break. There's like a DIY aesthetic there that really resonates with punk music. And yeah, I mean, there's other people who've talked about this. So Coral Manton, who's a visual live coder who I perform with often. Oh my God, I just looked at the time. I'm so running over. That's fine. So she talks about Algorave as its punk end of electronic music. The best performances are those where you don't know what's going to happen and you get the sense of figuring it out on stage. If we think about Algorave as punk programming, you know, we have this DIY music ethos. We're experimenting with forms, limits, and processes. It's really about centering the human in technological practice, performative failure, which I talked about for a bit too long, and these sort of open forms, making it what you want, and sort of a commitment to diversity, which I suppose is true of Riot Girl as well. It's also about doing simple stuff on stage and breaking things, which I think is quite a punk way to like deal with technology as well. So we're not about making well-structured code. We're just about hacking and making stuff work and then breaking it. And so I started thinking about making a piece which kind of appropriates Riot Girl and sort of reimagines it from the perspective of the algorithmic age. So I thought about how I might start to structure algorithmic music with punk, and what this means about how this could be used to sort of highlight the lack of women's voices. I mean, I suppose with Riot Girl, literal voices, as well as just women making music in electronic music scenes. And I also, because I'm working on projects with AI as well, thought it's an interesting way to use Riot Girl as a sort of cultural provocation pointing towards some broader problematics of data bias in music AI. So to say a little bit more about that, music AI sort of requires a lot of data, and in music AI, that data is music, to learn how to produce musical forms. But in these pieces and algorithms, we rarely know what music's actually used, and it's often not told when you investigate this what the sort of base data set was used. But those data sets do tend to prioritize easily quantified aspects of music. So traditional Western harmony, melody, pitch, rhythmic values, and not so much timbre, noise, stuff like that, which is maybe stuff that's really important in punk music. And very rarely uses harmonic traditions beyond the Western traditions. And there's also a lot of appropriation that goes on in this field. So there's quite a big global disparity in copyright laws. So I read about some projects where, because they can use American or European music because the copyright laws would mean they would have to pay something, they took music from, I think it was a Ghanaian pop groups, and used that because that country had really lax copyright laws, where they wouldn't need to either credit the musicians, tell them, or actually compensate them anyway. Yeah, and there's rarely any input from the artist in how this data is being repurposed or reused. So I guess I decided then to appropriate some music of my own, and so I thought I would appropriate feminism for making some AI music work. And so the work that I made is sort of an algorithmic remixing of Riot Girl. So I'm analyzing a database of Riot Girl music. And then I'm using some search algorithms to, within the performance, extract chunks of audio with particular characteristics. So I might be saying like, oh, I want you to give me some really noisy clips of music, and then I'm going to improvise with that and make some rhythmic patterns. And then I have another interface, which is maybe sorting things over longer arcs. So I can set up loops with that, where I'm saying I want a noise envelope that's like a sine wave, for example. So something that starts a bit pitchy, gets noisy, and then goes into something a bit more pitchy again. And so I'm using those two interfaces to essentially improvise a performance, which is referencing Riot Girl as a sort of like different input into music AI algorithms and punk-based Algorave performance. So it's all fairly simple code, pretty simple search algorithms. There's no server farms or machine learning involved. And I also don't really practice the piece either as sort of a further nod to punk music. And yeah, when I did the first two performance, I wrote the code to do the searching and sorting about 2 hours before. And I didn't really know if it was going to work properly, but it did. So that was great. So I have like almost no time left. So I was hoping to show you some software, but I think I'm just going to play you a clip of that in action. This is a performance I did earlier this year of this, which was an online performance. It was in April and all my gigs had been cancelled, and someone's like, oh, do you want to do an online performance? I was like, well, not doing anything else right now. So this is what you'll see is an overlay of, I did a performance using Super Collider and my other interface that I wrote. And then I went back and made my own visuals to sit on top of that with a piece of software called Hydra. So yeah, that's what's going on here. So I'll just play that for you. I think I'm just about out of time. I'm really sorry I didn't get to show you any software. If you want to post any questions in the chat, please do so. Otherwise, get in touch with me in any of these places, and there's also some links to some of the stuff that I talked about today.